The night Leo left us started with a siren. It was a sound that cut through the quiet of our street, sharp and cold. I remember Mom running down the hall, her feet making soft, panicked thuds on the old wood floor. Dad was behind her, his voice a low rumble I couldn't quite understand. They didn't tell me to stay in my room, but their silence was a wall I couldn't get past. I just stood in my doorway, watching the flashing red and blue lights paint our windows. The air felt thick, heavy with a fear that had no name. No one looked at me. It was like I had already started to disappear, even then. I tiptoed to the top of the stairs. I could see them in the living room, gathered around Leo's favorite chair. He wasn't in it. The paramedics were there, their faces grim and set. They spoke in hushed tones, using words I didn't know but felt in my bones. Words like unresponsive and too late. Mom was holding her own hand, squeezing it tight like she was trying to keep herself from falling apart. Dad just stared at the empty space on the carpet, his shoulders slumped. I wanted to ask what happened, to scream Leo's name until he answered, but the silence held me, a heavy blanket smothering every question before it could form. Later, after the siren faded and the flashing lights were gone, the house was quieter than I'd ever known. It was a deep, aching quiet, the kind that makes your ears ring. Mom went into the kitchen and started washing dishes that were already clean, her back to the rest of us. Dad sat on the sofa, not watching the TV, just staring at the black screen. They didn't talk about Leo. They didn't talk about the sirens or the paramedics. It was as if a storm had passed through our house, and now we were all just standing in the wreckage, pretending the sun was still shining and nothing had been broken. That night I crept into Leo's room. It smelled like him, like old books and the rain he loved to walk in. His guitar was leaning against the wall, strings facing out. His bed was unmade, the sheets all tangled up. It was the last place he had been himself. I sat on the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, and waited for someone to come and tell me what was real. I waited for someone to say his name, but no one came. The house just held its breath, and I was left alone with the ghost of my brother and a silence that felt like a final goodbye. A week later, Leo came back, or someone who looked like him did. He walked through the front door one afternoon, just as Mom was setting the table for dinner. He didn't say where he'd been. He just smiled a small, tired smile and took his seat. Mom gasped, a little sound of relief, and put an extra plate down without a word. Dad clapped him on the shoulder, a little too hard, and said, "Good to have you back, son." It was all so normal, so terribly, frighteningly normal. It felt like a scene from a play, and everyone but me had read the script. I wanted to scream, to ask where the real Leo was. This new Leo was quiet. My brother was never quiet. He was all loud music and laughter that shook the windows. This Leo moved through our home like a shadow. He ate his dinner without making a sound, his eyes always looking down at his plate. He didn't play his guitar. He didn't tease me about my homework. He just existed in the spaces Leo used to fill, a perfect outline with nothing inside. When I tried to talk to him, his answers were short. "I'm fine," he'd say, "just tired." But his eyes were empty, like two dark windows in a house no one lived in anymore. The strangest part was how my parents acted. They were so happy, so relieved. They treated this new Leo with a delicate care they never showed the old one. Mom would make his favorite meals, even though he barely touched them. Dad would talk to him about baseball, even though the new Leo never answered with more than a nod. It was like they had made a deal with the universe. They would accept this quiet, hollow version of their son, as long as they didn't have to face the empty chair at the table. They were pretending so hard I started to wonder if I was the one who was going crazy. My own loneliness grew like a weed in our silent house. I missed my real brother. I missed the way he'd ruffle my hair and call me kiddo. I missed his bad jokes and his loud, messy life. This replacement was a constant, painful reminder of everything I had lost. He was a stranger wearing my brother's face, and my family welcomed him with open arms. I felt like a ghost in my own home, the only one who remembered the boy who used to live here, the only one who seemed to notice that he was gone for good. The house began to change in small, unsettling ways. One day, I noticed Leo's guitar was gone from his room. It had always been there, a permanent fixture against the wall. When I asked Mom where it went, she just smiled and said, "Oh, he doesn't play anymore, honey." She said it so casually, as if it were a simple fact like the color of the sky. But Leo loved that guitar more than anything. He saved up for a whole year to buy it. It was a part of him, Seeing the empty space where it used to be felt like another piece of my brother had been scraped away, erased from our family's memory. Conversations became minefields of unspoken words. I would try to bring up a memory of the real Leo, something funny he did last summer. Remember when Leo tried to build that treehouse? I'd start. My dad would just clear his throat and change the subject. Did you finish your math homework? He'd ask, his eyes not meeting mine. Mom would get a tight, pained look on her face and walk out of the room. They were building a wall around the past, brick by silent brick. They were protecting themselves, and in doing so, they were leaving me on the other side, all alone with our shared history. My suspicion grew with each passing day. I started watching the new Leo more closely. He never slept, or at least I never heard him. Sometimes late at night, I'd hear faint noises from the basement, a soft scraping sound like something being dragged across the concrete floor. But when I'd ask him about it the next morning, he'd just look at me with those vacant eyes and say he was reading. He didn't own any books. The real Leo's books were still on his shelf, gathering dust. This new Leo was a lie, and the lie was getting bigger, filling up all the air in our house. I felt myself becoming invisible. At dinner, my parents would focus all their attention on the silent boy at the table. They'd ask him how his day was, and he'd nod. They'd tell him he looked tired, and he'd nod again. They never asked about my day. They never looked at me long enough to see the questions in my eyes. I was becoming a background character in my own life, a faded photograph on the mantelpiece. The more they pretended everything was fine, the more I felt like I wasn't there at all. Just a whisper in a house full of ghosts. One night, the scraping sound from the basement was louder than usual. I couldn't ignore it anymore. My heart was pounding, a frantic drum against my ribs, but I had to know. I slipped out of my room, the floorboards groaning under my feet. The house was dark, draped in shadows. I followed the sound down the creaky basement stairs, each step a small act of courage. The air grew colder as I descended, and a damp, earthy smell filled my nose. It was the smell of secrets, the smell of things that should have stayed buried. A thin line of light glowed from under the basement door. I pushed the door open just a crack, enough to see inside. The new Leo was there, his back to me. He was standing in front of an old, rusted freezer we hadn't used in years. He wasn't dragging anything. He was just standing there, perfectly still. But the cold wasn't just in the air. It was coming from him, a wave of icy emptiness that made me shiver. He slowly turned his head, as if he knew I was there all along. His eyes weren't just empty anymore. They were dark, deep pools of nothing. And in that moment, I understood. He wasn't a replacement. He was a vessel, a shell. He didn't say a word. He just pointed toward the freezer. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. My body moved on its own, drawn by a horrifying need to see the truth. I walked past him, my legs trembling, and I lifted the heavy lid. A blast of frigid air hit my face. Inside, covered in a thin layer of frost, was my brother. My real brother, Leo. He was pale and still, his eyes closed. He looked just as he had in my memories, peaceful but gone. The truth was cold and hard and right there in front of me. This thing wearing my brother's face was just a guardian of his body, a silent sentinel for my parents' denial. I stumbled back up the stairs, my breath catching in my throat. My own reflection in the hallway mirror looked strange, like a person I didn't know. My face was pale, my eyes wide with a truth no one else wanted to see. I realized then that they hadn't just replaced Leo. They had replaced me too. They replaced the daughter who asked questions with one who would stay quiet. They replaced the family we were with, a hollow imitation. I was as much a ghost as my brother was. I was just the one who was still breathing, trapped in a house that chose a comfortable lie over a devastating truth.